Deep Dive with Mohio.
Welcome, and today we're exploring something super important for all of us out there, especially those in the lab.
Oh, absolutely.
Lab safety essential.
Yeah, lab safety. We got to be careful, right?
You got to be careful.
I mean, we're working with some pretty serious stuff.
We are. We're dealing with, things that could potentially harm us if we're not cautious.
Exactly.
So we're going to be covering everything from, understanding those biological hazards, what are we actually dealing with?
Right. Those invisible enemies.
Invisible enemies, exactly. We'll be navigating the biosafety levels.
Those are key.
Making sure everyone understands what those mean.
Yes.
And, of course, mastering those personal safety practices because at the end of the day, it's about protecting ourselves.
Protecting ourselves and our colleagues. You got it.
Okay, so what are we actually talking about when we say biological hazards? What are some specific examples that come to mind?
Okay, so think about those tiny droplets that form when you're centrifuging a sample.
Okay.
They're practically invisible, but they could be carrying infectious agents.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or imagine a small tear in your glove while handling a particularly nasty specimen. You might not even notice it, but you're now exposed. These everyday exposures are what we need to be super vigilant about.
So these hazards, they're not always the big dramatic spills we see in movies.
Not always.
It's these little things that can really get us.
Right, the little things that we might overlook.
Okay, so we've got these, invisible enemies lurking everywhere.
Yeah.
How do we protect ourselves?
Right, well, that's where the biosafety levels come in.
Okay, tell me about those. I've heard those terms thrown around. But I think it'd be good for everyone to have a little refresher.
Yeah, absolutely. So think of biosafety levels as a roadmap to minimize the risks.
Okay.
You've got BSL-1, which is like your basic kitchen, pretty low risk.
Good.
Then you go up to BSL-2, that's where most clinical labs operate.
Okay, so that's like the standard.
Yeah, the standard.
Yeah.
You're working with agents that can cause disease but are treatable or preventable.
Okay.
So good microbiological practices, wearing appropriate PPE, having those biohazard signs, it's all about being cautious.
Right.
Then there's BSL-3, which is stepping it up. You're dealing with more serious stuff, things that can cause serious respiratory diseases.
And this is where we start talking about,
Right.
like, respirators.
Right, exactly. Those N95 HEPA filter respirators, the ones we've all become familiar with recently.
Yeah, I was going to say those have been in the news a lot lately.
They are essential for BSL-3 labs.
And then I imagine BSL-4 that's the highest level.
Yeah,
right?
BSL-4 is like maximum security. You're talking about deadly pathogens, often with no known cure. Think Ebola, for instance.
So not your everyday clinical lab.
Definitely not.
Okay, so let's circle back to BSL-2 since that's where most of our listeners are probably working.
Right.
What are some of the, trickier aspects of DSL-2 that maybe even seasoned professionals sometimes get tripped up on?
It's interesting. Even experienced folks sometimes get confused about when to use a biological safety cabinet versus a fume hood.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and it's an important distinction.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So a biological safety cabinet, it's designed to protect both you and the environment from the specimen you're working with.
Okay.
It filters the air, keeps everything contained, but a fume hood, that's primarily for protecting you from chemical fumes.
Oh, okay, so it's about what you're working with.
Exactly. You need to choose the right tool for the job.
That makes sense. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something that I think is a concern for a lot of medical lab scientists. Bloodborne pathogens.
Yeah, bloodborne pathogens, those are a big one.
Because we're exposed to blood and bodily fluids all the time.
Right, all the time.
So can you remind us, what are the main bloodborne pathogens that we need to be worried about?
Well, the big three are always top of mind. HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. Those are the ones we're constantly taking precautions against. But it's interesting how our understanding of these viruses has evolved over time.
How so?
Well, we have really effective treatments for hepatitis C now, and the hepatitis B vaccine is really effective at preventing infection.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that actually brings me to a question I've been thinking about. Does the availability of the hepatitis B vaccine change how we should approach bloodborne pathogens in the lab?
That's a great question.
Like, should we be less concerned if we're vaccinated?
Absolutely not. While the vaccine offers excellent protection, remember, standard precautions are there for a reason.
Right.
We treat every specimen as potentially infectious, regardless of whether we're vaccinated or not.
That's true. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
It makes you think about all those, everyday safety steps, like wearing gloves, washing our hands, disinfecting surfaces. It's really our first line of defense, isn't it?
It is. Those basic practices are fundamental.
I think sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming, though, right? Like we're constantly using bleach, disinfecting everything.
Yeah.
Are there any newer, more, I guess, eco-friendly alternatives that labs are starting to explore?
That's a really good point. And a lot of labs are starting to look at things like hydrogen peroxide vapor systems and UV disinfection technologies. They're showing a lot of promise.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, and they have a lower environmental impact, which is a huge plus.
That's great to hear. So we've covered a lot of ground here: biological hazards, biosafety levels, bloodborne pathogens. But I wanted to shift gears just a little bit and talk about personal safety practices.
Yeah.
Beyond just wearing the right PPE.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the things that maybe we don't always think about?
One thing that I've seen a lot more emphasis on lately, and I think it's really important, is ergonomics.
Ergonomics.
Yeah, we spend hours hunched over microscopes or pipetting, and that can really take a toll on our bodies over time.
That's true. I've definitely felt that.
Yeah, back pain, neck pain, carpal tunnel syndrome. We need to be mindful of our physical well-being, too.
So what are some things we can do to kind of combat that?
Well, simple things like making sure you have a good chair with proper back support, taking breaks to stretch, even just being mindful of your posture while you're working can make a huge difference.
That's a great reminder. We're so focused on protecting ourselves from these, immediate threats, but our long-term health matters too.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up, is there any, I guess, parting advice you'd give to medical lab scientists who are out there listening, who really want to, elevate their safety practices, take it to the next level?
I would say go beyond the checklist mentality.
Okay.
Think about the why behind each safety protocol.
That's good advice.
Understand the reasoning, and it becomes more than just a chore. It's about protecting yourself and your colleagues.
And I imagine that makes you more vigilant, right?
Exactly. And don't be afraid to speak up if you see something unsafe, even if it seems small. That's how we create a real culture of safety in the lab.
Speaking up is so important. We need to look out for each other.
We do.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into lab safety essentials.
My pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to Deep Dive with Mohiu. We hope you found this exploration of lab safety insightful, and remember, safety first.
Always.
Always.